Hey, folks. I am completely stunned that I have never recorded. Um, I have never recorded this section of my talk. I am stunned. I mean, to talk about it. But at any rate, black women in colonial America. Now, one thing that that black women contribute, well, involuntarily, obviously, um, to the American experience that isn't, if you will, contributed, in regards to like South America or even the Caribbean, is a stabilizing male to female ratio. That you have a closer male to female ratio than you have in many other portions of the Western Hemisphere. So you have that going for it. Also, while a good number of women are enslaved up north, keep in mind that we do see, well, I guess you could also say even slave women, but free black women involved in trades, that there is some level of social mobility. Granted, given the fact that they are black, there are elements of racial attitudes that kind of prevent too much of it. Um, Probably one fun one that comes to, but I mean, they're like, artisans, skilled workers, things of this nature. But one fun one that comes to mind is Lucy Terry Prince. And Lucy Terry Prince is, or was, if you will, well, we're not exactly 100% sure. She was enslaved. We do know that she wrote at least one poem that would be published much later. Um, it certainly wasn't the first poem published by a black woman or an African American, period. But nevertheless, she did write the poem, and eventually the poem did, if you will, become published well after the first African American to publish a poem. Phyllis Wheatley did. She was actually older than Phyllis Wheatley and actually lived much longer as well. So she actually was born before and died well after Phyllis Wheatley did. At any rate, with that being said, while you did have poets such as Lucy Terry Prince, and the name of the poem, by the way, was Bars Fight. It was about a Native American attack, if you will, on some of the good people of New England. I'm trying to remember if it was Massachusetts or something. At any rate, now there were, if you will, it was a little different down south. I mean, I guess it could happen, but there was extremely limited opportunities in the South, and certainly social mobility is going to be a problem down south. Okay, so at any rate, here you have the slave quarters. If you're wondering where are the beds, well, the beds are right here. There are the beds. A lot of workshops. So, you could very well have maybe one family, maybe you could have a couple of families in these cabins, perhaps. Now, one thing that distinguished, if you will, black women from indentured servants was the concept of giving birth, right? Well, indentured servants gave birth too, but and it could be complicated, but I mean, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion. You didn't need to have a contract for this, that a slave would be giving birth, a slave woman is going to give birth to a slave. Matrilineal perpetuation, right? It is, if you will, a foregone conclusion. They are considered strong workers in the field, at least they were, compared to indentured servant white women. Now, this is not to say that this was always the case, but this was a common impression. Now, of course, you could also imagine what that's going to mean, right? On the one hand, it's complimentary. They consider them to be good workers. But also keep in mind, if they're considered strong workers in the field, then guess where you want them? In the field. And guess who you want more of them than necessarily indentured servant women, right? You want, if you will, these slave women on the field. Keep in mind that they have to balance this with their home life. And clearly, the plantation life, or whatever the master's asking for, comes first, correct? In a sense, they're kind of not really even true matriarchs, if you really think about it, because these slave women are expected, if you will, are expected well, let's put it this way. So, who does Johnny answer to? Johnny is Margaret's son. Okay. Well, generally, Johnny probably answers to Margaret in the home, but let's say if Master says something different, right? Well, who is Johnny supposed to, adhere to? Well, clearly, Johnny is really answerable to the master, right? And this includes patriarchs too, right? That the final word isn't from Johnny. Isn't from Margaret or John. The final word is from Master Reynolds or whoever. The master clearly owns all of the people in that home, master or mistress. One issue, of course, you also have is because of the work and clearly neglect because of the fact that you are a slave first and I suppose parent second, regrettably, under the eyes of the law. You could have a good deal of poor health from the children, and we're going to talk about that a little later. Yes, we have quite a few children who will die quite a bit early. This is a brutal institution when it comes to children surviving. Not only did you have women in the fields, but you also had women in the house as well. You did indeed have house slaves as well, and they were certainly answerable to the master, obviously. It tended to be that there would be close supervision of a number of these domestic slaves. I'm not saying that there wasn't loose supervision in some cases, but oftentimes they want to know where these folks are in the house and consider, some of the things that they're in charge of, right? Eating, wet nurses, given the fact that you have, whites that have enslaved these people, you could imagine that folks are worried about, what is going to go into their mouths, right? Are they going to be poisoned? Close supervision on these nurses, wet nurses. Those are people who suckle, children that aren't theirs, or, feed them, breastfeed children that are not theirs. So you have that close supervision of these folks, cooks, so on and so forth. Treatment of women. Clearly, these women are working from sun up to sundown, 12 hours, at least 12 hours, 5 to 6 days a week, generally 6 days a week. Sunday, I know in Georgia, Sunday was illegal to work, so. And once again, they aren't truly matriarchs in the sense that, hey, their children cannot, if master wants to override something, that's it, right? And once again, that's the same case with daddy. There was a prevalence of rape, if you will, on these plantations. I don't have exact figures, but we do know that it happened and it happened often. But remember, rape is a sexual act. And unfortunately, a number of women did become pregnant. If she had slept with another slave, other than her slave husband, obviously that's certainly something that they shouldn't, you know, um, fact is, maybe you could say that, okay, well, hold on a second. We don't know if it really looks like this guy over here. That's a coincidence, basically the kid comes out black, right? So you're thinking that it's probably from the slave father, but if master, if you will, rapes, and master seems to be, if you will, um, master seems to be black, right? White. You do have black slave owners, very few of them. You do have them. But 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, master's white. So, next thing you know, you see this kid, you're like, nope, hold on a second. There's something up here. That brings about a number of, if you will, complications there. It's also possible that the slave woman could be very fair skinned, but at any rate, it brings about complications. It's like, well, okay, my goodness. Not only am I working for master, he also is sleeping with my woman, my wife. You can imagine some of the complications and raw emotions from that. Forms of punishment. Well, I think it's pretty clear what the number one form of punishment tended to be, and that was through whipping, right? And once again, think about it. Violence has oftentimes been a means of control, right? So for example, somebody robbing someone, robbing a convenience store or something, right? Well, the gun is there not necessarily to just kill people. It's there to get you to do what the bank robber or what the convenience store robber wants, right? And so, same principle, except in this case, they're likely to be using the whip. It's used as a means of control. I need you to do this. You don't do this, you get whipped. You didn't do it fast enough, you get whipped. You smart it off, you get whipped. I need you to follow a certain path. You don't follow that path, you get whipped. Although sometimes flogging was used for the sake of intimidation. Maybe you'll whip a little bit more, just to make sure that you make an example out of someone. You have Virginia King Carter, who believes very much in this idea of whipping and whipping often. There was a fellow by the name of George Washington. Trying to remember where I know that guy from. But at any rate, there was a fellow by the name of George Washington. And George Washington said this, basically it's like, hey, look, if they didn't do anything wrong, don't be whipping them, But if you have to, then whip, you should have, if you will, a liberal use of the lash. You should be whipping and whipping often. If the person had done it, you should whip them liberally, quite a bit, And we're talking about cases where, I don't know. Certainly 25, 30 lashes would be, certainly a punishment to, But it could go a good deal higher than that, It could go several times higher than that, for sure. And certainly in probably some more extreme incidents, you probably had folks who whipped, 75, 100 times, if not more. More extreme forms of punishment. Well, back to King Carter here. King Carter is asking for permission to mutilate, if you will, his slaves. And by that, I mean, not necessarily, I don't mean wood chipper, but maybe, putting scars in, maybe cutting off limbs, that kind of mutilation. So I'm not talking about putting a whole person in a wood chipper, and I don't mean that to the point of death, but maybe taking a body part off so they'll understand how serious this is, or maybe scar them to the point where they understand how serious this all is. There was also this threat, if you will, of separation. A threat of separation, behave or I'm going to, sell you to somebody, and you'll be apart from your family. And so you may see that, that level of stress, being, if you will, at issue. So. Minor forms of protest. Minor forms of protest. So as we talk about, if you will, these minor forms of protest, one of them being, well, hold on a second. Let me see if I'm trying to think of, so by what I mean by this is generally there's not much harm. It might be very subtle. You might not even understand that they're protesting against you. That's basically what I mean by minor forms of protest. And certainly on a smaller scale of things, right? We're not talking about, a rebellion or anything. Far, 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 far from it. There's gold bricking. What is gold bricking? Well, gold bricking is basically the idea that maybe you won't do something as soon as someone's telling you to do it. You understand? Maybe you're not going to do something super duper quickly. That's what we're talking about. Or at all. Johnny, I need you to spare that tobacco. Well, Master, I'll get to it. Something like that. Petty forms, if you will, of sabotage. Johnny, I need you to dig a hole over there by the field. Oh, Master, the shovel's broke, Master. I can't do it. Well, the reason why the shovel's broke is probably because that Johnny broke the shovel. So you may see, if you will, tools being broken. Now, sometimes it can get, those petty forms of sabotage can metastasize or grow to larger problems. Torturing an animal, for example. You torture a horse. And next the master rides the horse, and the horse is a mighty strong animal, and throws, if you will, the man off, and he dies. Obviously, that goes from minor form, or petty, to a little bit more than petty, to a real problem. Fugitive slaves. Now, as I am writing this, understand that you had slaves from all, demographics, escaping, women escaped, men escaped, middle-aged men escaped, lesser extent, older men might escape. But typically younger men tended to escape, and typically those that don't have much many attachments, whether it be a kid or a wife or something like that. Someone more fleet of foot, 20, 21 years old. With that being said, it's also true that, a number of folks could be escaping. Maroon communities. So, that is to say, folks who are escaping, maybe off into the woods, likely onto the islands, where they may not be found, and they can, if you will, conduct um, life for them independent of slaveholders, and probably where you have almost like a pharaoh circumstance. Well, pharaoh might not be the word, but what I mean is this idea of reverting back. So not necessarily being westernized anymore, but reverting back, if you will, to more traditional African cultures. That's what I mean by it. So, not necessarily wild per se, but back to, a mode or view of society that would be independent of being slaves. So, going back to African traditions. So it's a little cavalier with the word. At any rate, rebellions. Oh, Lord have mercy, rebellions. And understand that we had rebellions in a number of places. I mean, a few down south, quite a few down south, but also a few, up north. One of them that I have here was definitely a slave rebellion. Another one may or may not have been. Matter of fact, I think many of us are inclined to believe that it probably wasn't. But 1712, we had the New York, if you will, the New York City Rebellion. Understand that most slaves, in New York, or many slaves, if not most of them, were in the cities. Many of them, if you will, were in the cities. And we're talking about a good-sized, large population of slaves, if you will, in New York City. Now, would it compare to, the plantation slaves of the South? Well, no, but for the most part, no. But nevertheless, a good size. Understand that there were people who were concerned in New York City about slaves. They want to know where they are at all times. So you have to keep that in mind. They weren't necessarily treated very well all the time, if at all. And the next thing you know, you wind up having, if you will, a slave rebellion. A slave rebellion. This slave rebellion is going to claim the lives of a few whites, for sure. A few. I don't know. Maybe 9 or so. We're not even sure if it was a very large slave rebellion, in the sense that we know for sure 23 people participated in it, maybe 50 to 100 more, hard to say. But nevertheless, this New York City rebellion caused a number of whites to, one thing is they brutally executed a number of them. But secondly, they also were like, well, we're sure that many more of these folks must have done something. And they arrested, more than those 23 people. So anyway, and of course, New York is going to be on the lookout for more slave rebellions. And then, of course, you had a fire in 1741 that they attributed, if you will, to slaves. Put slaves, if you will, on trial, convicted, if you will, a number of slaves. So, I'm trying to think what else I want to say about this. I do know there was actually a play, if you will, that that talks about this great fire, this great outrising in New York. So try to remember what the name of it is, if it's Slave Plot or whatever. But anyway, actually had the opportunity to watch it. 1739, you had, if you will, the Stono Rebellion. For all intents and purposes, pretty much around Charleston, if you will, South Carolina. And once again, in 1739. Poor treatment was an issue. Malaria was an issue. And obviously a number of these slaves found themselves to be restless. As a result, you're going to see a large contingency of slaves around South Carolina, the Low Country, if you will, Charleston, if you will, attacking, if you will, areas, attacking their masters. Now, one of their biggest issues is they're not trying to hold South Carolina per se, or Charleston, but they're trying to escape, if you will, to Florida. Now, what they might not know is it might still, even if they were to escape, that would probably be difficult because now there is a buffer state called Georgia that would probably make life even harder for them. But they're hoping to eventually get to Florida, where they probably have heard that independence that Florida would grant them independence, and so they escape. They try to escape, but they're caught. A good number of Africans are going to be killed in this. Well, obviously, you had at least about 25 colonists killed, but then you're going to have more Africans being killed, 35 to 40. They're going to cut their heads off, put them on pikes just outside of Charleston, and the idea was basically, okay, look, if you think about escaping, this is what's going to happen to you. Now, I think it's also important to bring up that that these rebellions tended to be more turbulent. If you will, you had more turbulence, if you will, in Brazil and in the Caribbean than you did per se in the not in the Americas, because Brazil is part of the Americas, but in the 13 colonies. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean it wasn't a problem, because it most certainly was. I was about to ask if there's any questions, but at any rate, I'll put this up on YouTube and it will be readily available for you. Okay, take care, folks.